Page 28, Chapter 1, The Power and Independence of the Federal Reserve. The problem wasn't only the inappropriate banker influence on the system, it was also one of governance. With such an organization as the Federal Reserve System, wrote Eslis, assistant organization as the Federal Reserve System, wrote Eslis, assistant and partner in Fed Reform, Lachlan Curry, it is almost impossible to place definite responsibility anywhere. The layman is completely bewildered by all the officers, banks, and boards. Even the outside experts know only the legal forms. Eslis proposed a radical legislative overhaul to resolve both the problems of governance and banker influence. The second founding of the Federal Reserve, the Banking Act of 1935. Eslis said Roosevelt on the proposal. He committed the presidency to the passage of Eslis Bill. The Eslis accepted governorship so that he could more effectively lead the legislation through Congress from inside the Fed. The New York Evening Post summarized the point perfectly. Mariner S. Eslis is a unique figure in American finance, a banker whose views on monetary policy are even more liberal than those already embraced by the New Deal. Curry, a Canadian-born economic, Eslis met when they both served at the Treasury. Followed Eslis to the Federal Reserve Board. Curry was an economist whose academic work had been critical of economic theory that supported Fed policy from its inception. Fortunately for us, he was also an active memo writer. The problem, as Curry saw it, was not about eliminating private control as a formal matter. The original Federal Reserve Act had plainly stated that the Federal Reserve Board would supervise the Federal Reserve banks. The question was whether that the supervision could be plausible. Curry described the situation in 1934 memo to Eslis. Decentralized control is almost a contradiction in terms. The more decentralization, the less possibility there is of control. The problem was that even though the Federal Reserve Act provided a very limited degree of centralized control, the system by itself, virtue of necessity, was forced to develop a more centralized control of the open market operations. The ad hoc institutional development consisted of 14 bodies composed of 128 men who either initiate policy or share in varying degrees in the responsibility for policy. The 14 were the 12 reserve banks, the Federal Reserve Board, and once powerful Federal Advisory Council, a group of bankers that advised the Federal Reserve Board. These various bodies and their governors and boards made governance and public accountability a virtual impossibility. Curry glumly concluded that such a system of checks and balances is calculated to encourage irresponsibility, conflict, friction, and political maneuvering. Anybody who secures a predominating influence more concentrate on handling men rather than thinking about policies. In light of these problems, in Eslis and Curry's view, the structure had to change, and radically. Their timing was impeccable. The New Deal experimenters were embarking on a legislative frenzy known as the Second Deal. In a single legislative session, Congress passed 5 major pieces of legislation, including the Social Security Act, the Wagner Act, which reshaped American labor law, the Public Utility Holding Company Act, the Banking Act, and the Revenue Act, a controversial tax bill known by critics and defunders alike as the Soak the Rich Bill. Eslis' Banking Act of 1935 was the least controversial of the 5. Least controversial perhaps, but in some sense also of the most consequential. The act created a system that represented a dramatic departure from every other experiment in central bank design in U.S. and indeed world history. It abolished the Federal Reserve Board created in 1913 and replaced it with the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve Board remains in wide, if anachronistic, use to refer to the Board of Governors. It is also demoted the heads of the Federal Reserve Banks, who would no longer carry the name Governor. That title would be reserved for the members of the Board of Governors. As the Reserve Banks, the head would be the President. This was intentional demotion. Unlike in politics and banking, lingo, a governor was an august title reserved to the central bank. A mere president would be any Joe from the corner savings and loan. There was one hitch to Essl's sweeping reform. Carter Glass, that jealous guardian of the Federal Reserve System, its original sponsor in the House Fed chair under Woodrow Wilson and now Fed caretaker as the senior senator from Virginia. Essl's proposed IRKED, Glass greatly irked, who retaliated by holding up Essl's confirmation hearings as the Federal Reserve Board's governor. There may also have been a scene or sense of longing for what might have been for Glass. The aging senator was very nearly Roosevelt's first Secretary of the Treasury and was in fact offered the position first. He had accepted it. He would have been Essl's boss when Essl's first floated the prospect of a demolition derby of Glass's beloved system, but Glass would have been a bad fit for FDR's administration, but not just because his health was fading. Glass was in his core deeply conservative and hated almost everything about the New Deal. Despite lending his name to one of the signature's achievements, the Glass-Steagall bill, in fact, his record of opposition to the New Deal was based on a study of 31 bills on which he voted. 1933 to 39 was 81% opposed, easily the highest of all Democratic senators of the period. Since the reserve banks were essential to Glass's view of what the Federal Reserve System must be, their continued participation within the system became a point of compromise in getting Glass to endorse Essl's bill. As a result of that compromise, the reserve banks weren't removed entirely from federal policy making, despite Essl's preference for that removal. They became instead a presence on a newly reformed FOMC, which consisted of the 7-member Board of Governors, plus 5 Reserve Bank presidents on a rotating basis. As a result, while Glass sponsorship allowed the reserve banks to continue to give the system hints of federalism, Essl's was done when the Wilsonian compromise of the Federal Reserve figure 1.2 illustrates the difference. The reserve banks weren't the only ones shown the door. By the Banking Act of 1935, the Treasury Secretary was also out. For Treasury Secretaries like Andrew Mellon, the second longest serving secretary, second only to the early 19th century Secretary Albert Gallatin, the chairmanship of the Federal Reserve System was largely a ceremonial post, but others were different. Glass, Mellon's immediate predecessor as Secretary of the Treasury, had, perhaps like the jealous father he was, essentially treated it as a bureau of the Treasury instead of a board independent of the government. The removal of the Secretary was Glass's idea, in fact. Apparently, if he couldn't control it, he wanted to make sure others in government couldn't either. As historian David Kennedy was written after the 1935 Act, the Fed now had more of the trappings of a true central bank than any American institutions have wielded since the demise of the Bank of the United States in Andrew Jackson's day. It was more than that. The Federal Reserve System looked not only like a true central bank, but was a key step in what economic historian Charles Goodhart was called central banking's evolution. From private banks running a private banking policy with public benefits to a public central bank in the modern sense of the word, the Fed didn't join the fold of central banks. At last, in 1935, Essl's and the FDR had created a new central banking model altogether. Ironically, just as the Secretary of Treasury at the time, Henry Morgenthau, however you pronounce that, tried, was removed from the Fed's Board of Governors. Page 32. Eslis sought to coordinate fiscal and monetary policy in the joint mission of lifting the economy out of depression. Coordinate may even suggest more separation between the Fed and the Roosevelt administration than Eslis intended. He meant for monetary policy to be administration policy. In fact, Eslis' clear policy expressed before Utah bankers or to FDR's Treasury was to use all policy instruments at the government's disposal to do for what the economy, what consumers could not do, spin their way out of the Depression. It is no surprise that the Eslis Fed in 1930 saw less of a need to declare formal independence from the government as the Banking Act of 1935 had done in declaring independence from private bankers. Even during a brief and painful interlude of further recession in 1937 through 38, the Fed's policy during the 1930s was fully congenial to the administration's, and then came war. Eslis' views on fiscal monetary coordination during economic depression were born of the fear of deflation. That is, he believed government was the only force capable of stopping the economic freefall. His views on fiscal monetary coordination during the war to the same conclusion via a different path. War on the nation's mortal enemies was no time for anything but full-throated support of anyone with the democracy, including and perhaps especially the central bank. The day after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Eslis sprang into action to reassure the nation that the Fed would stand by the war effort. In its annual report in 1941, the Fed declared that it was prepared to use its power to assure that the ample supply of funds is available at all times for financing the war effort, and to exert its influence toward maintaining conditions in the United States government, security markets that are satisfactory from the standpoint of the government's requirements. In practice, this meant that interest rates from government debt were pegged, 90-day bills at less than 0.5%, one-year bonds at less than 1%, and long-term debt at 2.5%. Despite the Fed's refounding in 1935 as an agency unto itself, the war brought it squarely under presidential control. The third founding, the Fed Treasury Accord of 1951. After the war, and with new administration in place, the glory days of the Fed Treasury coordination against the common enemies of economic depression and fascism came to an end. The close relationship between the Fed chair and the president did too. Eslis was Roosevelt's man, not Truman's. Whether because of differences in personality or policy perspectives, or no shared history, Eslis did not remember his time as Truman's Fed chair with warm regard. There were years of frustration and failure as I tried in my limited capacity to influence public thought and governmental policy. Part of the problem was not only the times had changed, but that Eslis had changed too. From his early days as a Proctor-Keynesian in 1932, Eslis became what we would call today an inflation hawk. He saw risks of runaway inflation and continuing the peg he had established in 1942 here with others inside the Federal Reserve System, especially New York Fed President Alan Sproul. Eslis began an effort to subvert the subordination of monetary policy. That Eslis's own policy had created a side note. Central banking poets co-opted from war-making poets the metaphors. I think that's supposed to say war-making prophets, but it does have the word poets in there. The metaphors of doves and hawks. Central banking doves are those more likely to prioritize a central bank's commitments to mitigating unemployment. Hawks are more likely to prioritize the commitment to fighting inflation. Truman was not impressed and had no patience for this kind of posturing in 1948. In a unique instance in Fed history, Truman refused to reappoint Eslis to the chair he had held since 1935. Instead, Truman offered him the vice chair, presuming that such a public and obvious demotion would cause the proud millionaire to return to his business interests in Utah. Instead, Eslis expressed his interest in accepting the offer. Outfoxed Truman ignored Eslis's acceptance and appointed industrialist Thomas McCabe as the new chair. The president pointedly never filled the vice chair, which stayed vacant until 1955. Page 34. Truman may have hoped for leaving Eslis with neither chair nor vice chair would have finally pushed the Utahian out. It did not. For the first time, the last time in the Fed's history, the former chair stayed on as governor for no longer than a perfunctory transition period. If Eslis made noises about removing monetary policy from the Treasury as Fed chair, he now made full speeches and something of a crusade to warn all the country from the dangers of the inflationary pressures that were building. The peg had caused rampant inflation. The risks were dire. The depression was wartime justifications no longer applied. Eslis advocated a policy that would end the Fed's domination by the administration. Eslis's insubordination quickly and surprisingly reached the newspaper headlines. As the hostilities of what would come to be called the Korean War began, concerns about the conflict's inflationary consequences became a source of open speculation as to whether the Federal Reserve would continue to support the long-term government bonds. At the 1942 peg, Truman fought back and called the Fed chair Thomas McCabe at his home and gave his subordinate the president instructions. As McCabe presented to the board at their next meeting, the Federal Reserve Board should make it perfectly plain to the New York bankers that the peg is stabilized. The alternative, the president warned, would be for the board to allow the bottom to drop from under our securities. Truman concluded with ominous warning. If that happens, that is exactly what Mr. Stalin wants. A war of public speeches followed. Treasury Secretary John Snyder implied that the Fed remained committed to the peg. New York Fed President Sproul countered days later. Eslis drew attention to the Fed's subtle but clear signal that the peg was not a guarantee. Finally, Truman had enough and summoned for the first and last time in Fed history the Federal Open Market Committee to the Oval Office for a presidential lecture. Immediately thereafter, he issued a press release that presented the false view that the Federal Reserve Board, SIC, has pledged its support to President Truman, and the market for government securities will be stabilized at present levels, and these levels will be maintained during the present emergency. It is a testament to the Federal Reserve System's confusing governance that of the president referred to the Federal Reserve Board instead of the FOMC, the committee that would have had the authority to make the decisions the president hoped to see. Eslis hit back hard. Made newspapers the internal memorandum the board had prepared on behalf of the FOMC to summarize what occurred at the Oval Office meeting, directly and publicly disputing the Truman administration's account. What became known as the Treasury-Fed dispute was now litigated in the public eye. As Eslis put it in his memoir, his press leak meant one thing: the fat was in the fire. Cooler heads on staffs of both the Treasury and the Fed intervened to come to grips with the internal dispute. They decided to resolve the issue once and for all by hammering out a durable compromise that would honor the Fed's desire to respond to inflationary pressures as they arose, and the White House's fear that uncertainty in interest rates would make it possible to fight communism in Asia. From the Fed staff, Winfield Reifler led the way. From the Treasury, the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, William McChesney Martin. The two of them constructed a single sentence that would allow both sides to declare victory, but committed no one to anything. It was a truce. In the words of Fed historian Donald Kettle, after agreeing to the terms, both sides announced that they had accepted the compromise, which came to be known as the Fed Treasury Accord. The problem? There was nothing more to compromise than the awkwardly worded announcement itself. Here it is in full. The Treasury and the Federal Reserve System had reached full accord with respect to debt management and monetary policies to be pursued in furthering their common purpose, to assure the successful financing of the government's requirements, and that at the same time to minimize monetization of the public debt. Even a reasonably well-informed citizen or lawyer of the day could not have recognized the extraordinary import of this dense sentence. In fact, some in Congress thought very little of so informal an arrangement. In congressional hearings after the announcement of the accord, Senator Paul Douglas, D. Illinois, 1949 through 67, a prominent economist, long critical of Treasury control of the FOMC, made it clear that he thought the accord of the Secretary Snyder's subsequent attempts to clarify its meaning were bogus. In Senator Douglas's words, Talleyrand said the words were used to conceal thought. I have always thought the words should be used to express thought, and it is the lack of this quality which I find unsatisfactory in your testimony throughout. Senator Douglas's was a fair critique. In fact, there was more to the deal than this inscrutable announcement. Shortly after the release, Chair McCabe resigned from the board. Mariner Esliss followed in July. They were replaced in two Treasury insiders, William McChesney Martin as chair and James Robertson, former first deputy of the comptroller of the currency. Senator Douglas saw the resignation of the two senior members of the Board of Governors and their replacement by two Treasury insiders as something of unofficial deal that the truce declared in accord meant business as usual for the Treasury-dominated Fed. Truman certainly hoped so to enforce the uncertain terms. Truman was sending what he hoped would be his Trojan horse. It didn't turn out that way. To the jargon of his patrons in the Truman administration, William McChesney Martin, the former Truman insider, quickly established that the Fed Treasury Accord did not mean what Truman thought it meant. After the accord, the Treasury continued to issue long-term debt and the pre-peg rate, and Martin expressed willingness to support and coordinate those efforts. He also pushed against the perception and reality of the peg, and eventually made clear that he too would abandon it. Markets, not the Fed, but set those rates. None of this sat well with President Truman. On Martin's report at the next meeting at the event of the New York City Hotel, Truman had but one word to say to the affable Martin: traitor. With the Fed Treasury Accord, the Truman administration strategy seemed to be speak inscrutably at a point a big stick. They succeeded on the first part, but not the second. As a result of Martin's appointment, on which more next chapter of the accord became seen as the start of the modern Federal Reserve System and a major achievement for the country. It has become Fed's third founding after the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 and the Banking Act of 1935. Unclear though it may be, written with the intent to conceal though it may have been, this sentence forms the basis in perception and in fact of the idea of the Fed's monetary policy is institutionally separate from the economic policies of the president. That idea held sacred by most central bankers. It is at the core of the Ulysses Punchbowl conception of the Fed independence, and it comes from a sentence almost completely devoid of content. We'll see more in the next chapter how this empty sentence took on a life of its own. But the point to note now is that the words didn't have much content. From the form didn't either. The Fed Treasury Accord is purely informal. It is not a statute of regulation, nor binding law enforceable in any court. In fact, some within Congress in favor of separating monetary from fiscal policy thought the informality of the accord was extremely dangerous. Nonetheless, the accord stuck and has endured. In some ways, it performed even better than a statute might have done. Recall that in Banking Act of 1935, the Secretary of Treasury was struck from the Board of Governors. The statutory removal was essentially irrelevant to the question of the fiscal domination of monetary policy. The seeming meaningless sentence published in the Fed Reserve Bulletin was not. Conclusion: the three foundings of the Federal Reserve. In 2013, the Board of Governors commissioned a mug as a gift to employees to honor the Federal Reserve centennial. The mug is handsome as far as mugs go. It's a striking cobalt blue with the gold trim and carries on the front of the seal the Federal Reserve, a seal much like the seal of the U.S. President, an eagle over the semicircular stars and bars, but with both feet gripping olive branches instead of the one foot with arrows. Circling the eagle are the words Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. Underneath it all, the mug boldly declares its purpose in gold letters: 100 years. As readers of this chapter have learned, and the mug's designers have either forgotten or chose not to disclose, the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System is not 100 years old. The Board of Governors wasn't created until 1935. In the S-list written Roosevelt-backed banking of the Act of 1935, the party celebrating the centennial announced on this mug shouldn't begin for another 20 plus years. The old Federal Reserve Board, created by the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, no longer exists. The Board of Governors structure abolished it. This chapter told the story of the Fed's three foundings. The narrative omits much about the Federal Reserve in its first half century, but is useful for setting the stage of understanding the Fed's unique governance. Find this geographic space within which it operates in two ways. First, it demonstrates just the arcane, complicated, bureaucratic jumble that its modern Federal Reserve System comes from. That jumble in the consequence of institutional layering, or the reality of that institutional design doesn't happen on a blank slate. The second founding of the Federal Reserve occurred not only against the backdrop of pre-existing institutions, but also against pre-existing people. Senator Glass in 1935 preserved part of what Representative Glass in 1913 had fought so hard to create, hence the continued presence of the governed reserve banks. Even after the value of having these quasi-private, quasi-autonomous entities had disproven, and the third founding, the Federal Treasury Accord, came still on top of the others. New Federal Reserves grew up on top of the old ones. Second, the Fed's three foundings demonstrate not only the importance of law, but also the relationship between law and personability. Law is not irrelevant to the rise of the Federal Reserve System as a powerful and distinct actor within government, but it's insufficient to explain the full context of institutional change. The removal of the Secretary of Treasury from the Fed's boards coincided with a period of Treasury dominance of monetary policy. And in the third founding, the Fed Treasury Accord law was nowhere to be seen at all. The message is simple. In the institutional evolution of the Federal Reserve, law matters, but not in the ways people always accept. And personalities matter too. We'll see more of both in the chapters ahead.